Hi, welcome back to the Drum Workshop, Part 3. In this section, I'm going to go over my DAW and some of the plugins that I use in it to process my drum sounds. Also, some of the mixing techniques that I've found quick and helpful to getting a quick, good sounding drum mix. Here I've got Digital Performer opened up. Let's see what version this is. This is DP 11.22. I just updated it, and everything seems to be working well. One of the things that you're going to want to first do is make sure you're at the correct sample rate. You can select whatever you want, but I suggest using a 48K at 24-bit. There are other settings here in addition to that, but I prefer this. I find the fidelity is great. It's pretty much industry standard unless you want to go up to a very high sample rate. Unless you're doing video, I don't think you need to worry too much about the frames per second. But if you are syncing with video, you want to adjust that to whatever you're doing. So in my case, I'm shooting at 24 frames per second. You would do that right here so it would match up with your camera's settings. And when you're tracking, you're going to need to, you might need to decrease your buffer size down to 256 or 128 if you're getting any kind of latency in the drummer's headphones. I might have mentioned that earlier, but if there's a little bit of a latency problem, you might be getting a little echo in the drummer's headphones, and that's very distracting for someone who's trying to keep time. Even a slight echo can hinder that performance. So I always try to bump it down as low as I can, usually 128 if I don't have any plugins or anything like that going. And then later on when I'm done tracking, I'll bump it back up to a higher buffer rate for mixing. When I start applying all my plugins, I'm going to need that extra buffer size. But for tracking, I recommend 128 or maybe 256. There might be a slight little echo with that, but if anybody's noticing and saying, hey, there's an echo, just bump down your buffer size there. Problem with that is when you start doing high track counts, you're going to see your RAM usage go way up, and you might get some RAM clipping there indicated by the little red light. But if that's the case, just bump it up a little bit to 256 or something like that. Let's take a quick look at my bundles. This is basically my digital patch bay, all my ins and outs from my interfaces. I won't go too into that right now, but as you can see, I've got 32 inputs coming from the console, 1 to 1, 2 to 2, all the way up to 32. So I've got 32 total inputs coming from the console, and I've got an additional 8 inputs coming from my Apollo unit. But usually when I'm tracking drums, I'm using the console. I'm not relying too heavily on my Apollo unit for that. This is a straight off the board matrix here. I've got channels 1 through 12 allocated just for the drums, as you can see here. As we discussed, I've got 2 mics on the kick drum, 2 mics on the snare drum, 3 tom-toms, a hi-hat, a ride. Those are both spot mics. And then a drum talkback mic right there, as I mentioned earlier, for the drummer to speak back to me. And also overhead left and overhead right, as indicated by overhead left, hi-hat, overhead right, ride. Don't worry too much about this one right now. When I'm done tracking, I'm going to bust those 2 mono tracks into one stereo pair so that I can process those through a compressor. And I've got control of both of them with my master fader there, but we're going to do that afterward on tracking. What's nice about not tracking to a stereo pair like this and doing 2 mono tracks is that if the track is leaning a little left or right heavy, they're off balance, which is often the case, you can make adjustments right there and balance them out so you're getting a nice balanced stereo signal going to your stereo bus. I often find that one side's a little louder than the other, so if they're not locked into a stereo pair like that, you can adjust them separately, even just a little bit, and get a nice stereo balance there. And I pan those hard left and right, as you can see from my stereo mix. If you wanted to bring that in a little bit for not quite such a wraparound effect, you can easily do that right here. I used to kind of pan them wide open like that to get a wraparound stereo image, but I find that's kind of wide. And if you think about where your position might be in the audience if you're watching a band. The drum kit's not going to be wrapped around you. It's actually going to be more kind of out in front of you So you might want to do a little more of a conservative pan like that. If you want to go a little wider, you can like that. But usually I reserve those very outside perimeters of the stereo field for effects, things like that, that I do want to have kind of a wraparound effect, my reverbs, things like that. I kind of leave that room out there for that. So maybe bring your drum overheads in a little bit. And then, like I said, you can process those right there. I'm jumping ahead, of course, to the overheads. Let's go back to the kick drum here for a second. What you're looking at is, this is a live band, a trio, and I tracked different takes. I didn't set up a different project for each take. I just let them track take 1, take 2, take 3, and so forth. They did 4 takes here, and I kept them all. That's a method I really like doing. I don't have to close a project file and open it. If they're just tracking and trying to get a good take as a live ensemble, I'll just keep it all in one project, and then decide on the final take keeper that they want to use later. And then you can delete the other files if you want. But it's a real quick way to go. Then you're basically just operating a tape deck. You're just treating the DAW like a tape deck and not trying to create a whole bunch of different projects for different takes. I don't recommend that. It's a lot easier just to keep that tape rolling and let the band do all the heavy lifting. As you can see here, let me zoom in a little bit. So one thing you really want to get good at is using your keyboard commands to zoom in and out, so you're not constantly reaching for a mouse and trying to get these little buttons up at the top. I really recommend setting up your keyboard and learning where the power commands are. Typically, they're going to be a command with the up and down arrows. That's what I set them up for. You can customize that however you want. Sometimes it's the plus and minus key on the number pad. I've set it up so my zoom in and zoom out are on my command plus the arrows keys on my keyboard. And the up and down is vertical, left and right is horizontal. So that way you can zoom in and out quickly without touching your mouse. There's other things you can do to set up zoom settings. If you want to have a preset zoom, you can do that too. But I just prefer zooming in and out manually, like that. And then you've got your scroll on the side here. You can use your scroll wheel too, which I find is a little bit slower, but you can grab that handle right there and zoom up and down. And there you can see my different takes. Another thing I find very handy is in your track groups, right over here. You can set up groups so that when you check them, you're selecting, like in this case, I've got a group set up for the drums. If I have no groups assigned, I have to select them one at a time like that, or you can slide across, which is pretty quick. What you want to do is set up different groups so that you can turn the groups on or off with that little switch right there, which I keep handy. And then you can just hit record, or you can hit any button, and it's going to do that whole group. So all the drums are now soloed or muted or in record mode. It's really nice. You can also adjust the overall fader levels if you wanted to do something like that, or reset them all. You have a group control that way instead of doing things individually. And then if you want, you can easily turn that off to get individual control. I do that with all my sections too. Bass, keys, guitars, especially if you've got a big group of horns or something like that. It's really good to have a group set up with that. It's pretty easy to do here. Setting up groups is as easily as hitting your Control N. Control N will give you a little plus sign, and then you just go through and click on the groups that you want to include in that group. So Control N will give you a select new group, and you just select whatever group. They could be all tracks or just a number of tracks, like I've selected all my drum tracks right here. You can see they're blinking in green. And then you hit return or enter, and it's asking you what to name the new track group. In this case, I would it'll default to a group number, but you can type in whatever you want, drums. And also I recommend you can select here edit mix, edit and mix is the best one probably. And then you hit OK, and that'll defined that section of faders as that group. I've already got a drum group set up, so I'm not going to do that, but as you can see here. And then that'll pop up over here in your track groups, so all those new groups you set. So it's really nice if you're tracking a live ensemble. You can have the entire band or the rhythm section selected. That way, when I select a track, it's going to include all the microphones in that group. So if I've got a drummer, a bass player, a keyboard player, a guitar player, even a singer, I can assign all those as one group, as a live ensemble or as the rhythm section, whatever you want to call it. And that way, when you're tracking different songs, you can jump back and forth between selecting the entire group, or let's say the bass player wants to go in and do an overdub. You don't have to deselect that whole group. All you have to do is turn off the rhythm section, turn on the bass, and then you've got control over the individual tracks again. You see? And then if you wanted to go back to your rhythm section, you turn that back on and you're back in business there. So you can quickly arm tracks again and whatnot. So setting up track groups is something that really is it takes a little bit of time to set it up. But if you do that in your template and save it as a template, then every time you open up a new project, you've got all those track groups saved, and it's really easy to click and adjust sections like that. Saves a lot of time. Track groups. Another thing I do is I set up on my side, I set up a markers window over here. And by the way, these settings on the side, these side windows, I can adjust depending on how much of it I want to see. So you've got a marker window right here. To set a marker, you can go under the menu and hit Add Marker, but the simplest way to do is to do a Control M. And you can do that while the track is playing if you want. Control M and set markers that way. It'll just give them a number, and then you can go back in and option click to give them names. In this case, I've got take 1, take 2, but usually what I'll do on a song is I'll have a start, verse 1, verse 2, chorus, bridge, solo. I'll have those all set as different markers. So it's easy to navigate the song later on for mixing and editing. You can jump around. Also, it'll show up on your counter screen. If you've got that set up on the side, you can see, and the band can see where you are in the song as that flies by. You'll see it going with your time counter as well. So I recommend setting up a markers section here on the side. Here I've got my Soundbites list. It's just handy to have that right there. Usually what I'll do is at the end of the session, if there's obviously there's going to be a lot of stuff that you don't need, takes that you erase, but they're still sitting in your Soundbites section, so you can go in at the end of the day, select unused soundbites, and it'll highlight any soundbites that aren't being used in that project. Say you had a false start and hit record, but you're not going to use that, you want to erase it, you can hit, it'll still be in your Soundbites window and it'll still be taking up memory. So you can easily go in there and select unused soundbites and delete them. You don't have to do that, it's just a way to save some memory. Down below that, the last little window I have set up here is a event list. And what that shows me is an entire list of all the different events. In this case, there's not that much. There's just some markers set here. Where this is handy is if you're programming in conductor changes, like tempo increases or decreases, you'll see those here. And it's the best way to go in and change the tempo a little bit. If you wanted to have tempo changes, you can just go in here and do that. I'm not going to go into that too much right now because it's kind of outside of the scope of this workshop. That's more of a digital performer workshop, which I probably should do at some point. It's as you can see, it's a very deep and rather complicated DAW. It goes very deep, but if you set it up properly, you can make it basically like a mixing board and a tape deck to keep things really simple and without getting in too much into the nuts and bolts of it for fast tracking and quick setup for mixdown, which is what I'm trying to show you here today. Down at the bottom, you've got your inputs and outputs. Those are all assigned as part of my template. What I'm probably going to do is include a link so that you can download my digital performer template. instead of having to set all this up on your own. It's something I'm going to do for you guys and just allow you to quickly copy and paste my template, and then you can adjust it to your personal tastes. That way you'll have exactly what I'm looking at right here. I've spent a lot of time setting this up, and I'm always tweaking it. That's the thing about templates, is that it's kind of a never-ending castle. I'm always adding little features and bells and whistles to my template so that it functions even more smoothly, and then saving and updating my template. And then I save that as my default template, so every time I open up a new session, it opens up that same template. You can have different templates for different things, like if you're tracking an orchestral thing with MIDI or something like that, that you might want a different template for that. But most of the stuff I'm doing is band tracking or live musician tracking, so I've set up a master template for that here. At the very bottom, you'll see I've got, obviously, my track names. To change those, you option click, and you can also use your up and down arrows to go quickly between those. When you've typed in your name, you hit return. You can also assign track colors. You can't do it at the mixer level. I wish Motu would allow you to do that down there, but I don't know how to do that. So what I'll do is I'll go over to the sequence window, and then you can adjust the colors there. If you click the little icon right there next to the track name, it'll open this little palette, and you can select the different rainbows that you want. I usually do my drums in red. I do my cymbals in yellow, my bass in orange, and then I'll do my guitars in blue or green. Vocals I like doing in dark blue because it's easy to see and edit. I do a lot of editing in vocals, so that's a nice dark color to see. And then background vocals, I'll probably use a lighter shade of blue. Then I'm getting into my leads, purple typically. Sometimes I'll do my background vocals in pink, but here I've got my percussion in pink. In my template I have about 4 open tracks so I can do percussion overdubs quickly. They're all set to the same input settings, so I can do a tambourine and then a bongo and then a cowbell. 3 or 4 tracks ready to go for percussion is always a good thing to have. And then down below that, I get into my horns and strings and stuff like that. But for the drums, I keep them all in red, cymbals in yellow. As you can see, it's pretty easy to see them that way and distinguish between skins and brass. And I can zoom in here a little bit better and show you. This is one complete song. It's just the drums, a live bass, and a guitar amp, and we did a scratch vocal. That's a really nice way to record, and I've talked about that before. I always capture a live vocal, which I rarely use. Usually I'll go back and replace that later with a better microphone, but I like to have a live vocalist singing along with the band, just so everybody knows where the song is, and also it gives a good energy to the take too. But really what I'm going for is just the drum take. And if the bass player's doing a good job that day, we'll keep that too. Especially if the bass player and the drummer are in the same room or can see each other. There's a synchronicity that's important there with that visual contact that sometimes hard to replace with an overdub. So sometimes that energy is really good between the drummer and the bass player. So I try to capture that live. And then you can, if you're really happy with the drum take and the drummer's nodding his head about that, then you can say, okay, let's check out that bass track, because he's still plugged in, his settings are all the same. It's a good time to go ahead and fix any glitches that you want instead of trying to overdub it later, because then you're trying to set up that bass tone exactly the same. So what I'll typically do is find the drum take that works the best and everybody's happy with the drum take, and then I'll say give the drummer a break, disarm his tracks, and keep the bass tracks armed, and we can go in and do some punch-ins on the bass if necessary, scrutinize that bass line a little bit, instead of trying to match it up later. And then you've got a good solid performance between the drummer and the bass player. I wouldn't worry too much about the guitar at this point. We're probably going to go back and overdub that again later. But if you want to, go ahead. If you're trying to work quickly, you can go ahead after you're done with the bass player. Let's scrutinize the guitar track a little bit. If the band's in a big hurry, you can put a microphone up in the vocal booth, and while you're listening back to some of these tracks, you can let the vocalist go in there and cut a live vocal on a better microphone than the handheld 58 that you might be using. But I would recommend probably just sticking to the drums and bass, focusing on those two, and overdubbing your guitar and vocals and whatnot later on. Now I'm going to zoom in here a little bit so you can see a little more detail on the tracks. There we go. There's my kick. And you can see those kicks are nice. It's a nice loud signal. It doesn't have to be to the top. We're not going for to hit 0 or anything like that. I'm leaving myself plenty of margin of error there in case the drummer hits something really hard. It's not going to distort. And I can always go in later and bring up volume, but I can't reduce clipping. So you can always go in there and adjust. If a track is looking a little soft, a little low, recorded a little bit low, you can easily go in and adjust those levels with this little fader here on the side. It's one of the little hidden features that I really like. It didn't always used to have that, but it does now. It's a great thing. You can adjust the overall volume right there and bring that up. I wouldn't recommend going too loud because then it's going to distort. You can bring that up. That's not just a view. That's actually that's actually increasing the decibel level. In turn, you can reduce that too. If something's a little hot, you can go right in there, and that's adjusting the entire track. Okay, and you can do that on a per track basis. So if the outside kick was a little low, as you can see it is there, I can just, without normalizing or anything like that, I can just go in there and bring it up to a more usable level, and so forth. There's my ride cutting through loud and clear. There's the talkback in red. That's obviously got some good information there from that microphone that's back over the shoulder. And there's my two overheads, and you can see they look pretty balanced. The right-hand side might be a little quiet, so you could adjust that to the fader, or you could adjust that here as well with that side fader. There you can see they're a little better balanced, and that way it's not going to sit lopsided on your stereo faders. And then below that, of course, is the bass amp. And I always record a direct input, a DI, coming from the bass as well, in case we decide later on that we don't like the amp sound. We've got a DI coming off that bass. That's pretty standard practice with bass. Record one track of the amp. If you have an actual amp from the bass player, put a mic on that and record the amp to one track. And then the DI, the direct box, split to another channel with no processing. That way you can, if you don't like the amp or you want to add more to the amp, you can send that DI through a plug-in or back into a different amp if you want to reamp it as well. But typically what I'm doing these days is recording a plug-in amp. So I'll plug the bass player straight into a Sans amp or a plug-in bass cabinet, something like that, to simulate a bass cabinet, and then I'll also take a DI separate from that, just like the old days. But that's a good way to do bass. You want to be careful that bass and loud guitars aren't getting into your drum booth. That can mess up things a little bit if you have a guitar or a bass cabinet bleeding into the drum overhead microphones. That's why I really prefer using bass plug-ins, because they're not as boomy as a bass cabinet rattling the whole room. So your drum tracks are going to be really clean. Same with guitar recordings. Keep in mind that the guitar is just really being recorded as more of a guide track. You're probably going to overdub it later. So don't let the guitar player crank up his amp too loud. You got to remind him or her that you're trying to get drum takes, and that if his amp is too loud, that's going to bleed into the drum room. Even with the door shut, you got to be careful that sometimes those loud cabinets will vibrate, those overhead drum mics. And maybe if you want to replace that later or change the bass line, that ghost of your first bass or guitar might be leaking into your drums. So be careful of that. That's why plugins are great, because you're not getting any bleed whatsoever.